very interesting place in the homeschooling world right now. Homeschooling, as we know it, really kicked off in the 80s when they fought to legalize homeschooling in all of the different states. And it was really kicked off by people who were kind of anti-government. There was one side of it that was probably more on the religious side, that they were going to do it for religious reasons. And then there was also the hippie side, which was doing it more for, we don't want to be part of the government. And both of these sides agreed on the idea that they just wanted the government out of how they were going to educate their children. And they started to cultivate things. And as with everything, problems started to develop. And so in the late 90s and through maybe 2008, you really started to have some extreme views taught as doctrine. Mainly on the religious side. I think that the hippie liberal side has just kind of gone on their merry way and grown. But the religious side really lost its way and started to insert these crazy hyper legalistic ideals, and this is what your life needs to look like, and basically put the salvation of their kids on the parents and just all these unnecessary burdens. And it was bad. It led to a lot of abuse, it led to a lot of isolation, it led to a lot of people not being socialized. And not like in the way that the hippie side did, where they were just kind of happy, more commune-minded. This was more like we don't let outsiders in, as opposed to outsiders aren't trying to find us. It was like they were always looking over their shoulder for somebody coming and infiltrating the camp. And what's interesting is I would say 75% of the things they talked about sounded really good. It was like, oh, that sounds like a good idea. That sounds like a good idea. That sounds like a good idea. And then you keep listening and you're like, that took a sharp left. Are we using different Bibles? Oh, we are. Yours is the one that's too hard for me to read so that it makes you feel smarter. That makes sense. But I would say around the fall of Vision Forum, which happened in 2012, I think at that point, the homeschooling world really exploded in different directions. You saw a lot more secular homeschoolers, a lot more Jewish homeschoolers, a lot of pagan homeschoolers. You just started to see a lot more different pockets pop up. And what this did was create this great diversity within the homeschooling world. The problem is for a little bit, it took a while for the Christian homeschoolers to be comfortable with that, because there was so much baggage laid onto them that they were trying to shed that off. And also during that time, up until about 2012, the whole socialization thing really wasn't handled well. Again, it was more of an isolation of ideas, which means you weren't getting a lot of pushback from people in your group or having your thoughts challenged, and it created an echo chamber to socialize in. I don't know about you, but I don't want to socialize in an echo chamber. It just seems like you're just getting your own thoughts back to you. Like nothing's being challenged, and that's a problem. So a lot of the kids who are talking about the fact that they were not socialized or they weren't socialized well actually grew up in a time where it just wasn't being done well. It wasn't being done with any kind of health. Worse yet, it was being done in an isolating manner. How have you been socialized? Have you been socialized well? Yes, you have. So, for the people who are saying those kinds of what about socialization things, they're absolutely accurate. However, we are in a completely different era of homeschooling, and everything that started to be built 40 years ago is really coming to fruition. I would prefer you not to bite my arm while I'm doing this. And by what I mean by that is that now there's a whole bunch of resources available, a whole bunch of places that people can socialize. It's not just the same groups anymore. You have a lot more of the secular homeschooling curriculums available instead of just the Christian ones. You also have a variety of different Christian ones that are available, so it doesn't just have to be that. There's also Muslim and Jewish ones, pagan. Like there's truly just this diverse group of homeschoolers at this point. I have the wrong end of you now. For as many terrible things happened during COVID, the one thing that really benefited it was the shutdown of schools. With the shutdown of schools and the amount of parents who were at home, a lot of parents invested their time into building something when it comes to being able to homeschool easier, better, more efficiently. For people who fit more of the traditional school mold and now have decided, wait, we can homeschool our kids. So you have not only a wider variety of people who are homeschooling, but you also have a bunch of additional resources that we didn't have when I started. So I think it's important to remember the history of how homeschooling came to be, because the people who pioneered the freedoms for us to be able to homeschool now really should be thanked for what they did, even though people who came after them drove things way off into weird lands. But what they did give us is our freedom back to be able to keep our children home and have a home education system. And now we're at a time, because of the innovators that have come from the homeschooling world. You're making this video so hard. Why are you the way that you are? Anyway, the innovators that came around really made it so that homeschooling is a viable option for the majority of families and no longer something that only happens in the fringe of our country. Post-COVID, the homeschooling numbers went from quadrupling up to 8 times what they were prior. That means more diversity, more people, more kids, more socialization, more activities, and more really unique things to help our kids be prepared for the world of tomorrow and not the world of yesterday. So, for as much baggage as there is from the pioneers of the homeschooling movement, they really did set us up for what we've been able to build now. We have been able to separate the wheat from the tares in most communities and be able to thrive on the wheat. This is why a lot of the myths, like what about socialization and they're not going to be prepared for the real world and all of those things don't count anymore. They're tired arguments of what happened 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when it really was difficult to do those things. It's not even remotely hard now. So this is why when we talk about home education at this point, it's so dramatically different than any other time in history. And hopefully this gives you a few talking points for the next time you hear, but what about socialization? I mean, what about it? I mean, literally in 15 minutes, my kids' friends are all coming over to the house, including my best friend. Their kids ages 16 down to 11, and they're going to watch the Mario movie. And they're all friends. They all are friends together. At least I think they're going to watch the Mario movie. I just heard there were some complications in renting it. I don't know. But they're all going to socialize together because they don't think about their world in grade levels. Another wonderful thing about our world. It's nice to have all these myths busted. And now I need to go deal with this. Shall we?